Chris is presenting information about the Chowilla annual fish condition monitoring. He's a scientist and fish ecologist at the South Australian Research and Development Institute, SARDI. He has 20 years experience researching the ecology of fish of the lower River Murray, with a major focus on the Riverland and Chowilla Icon Site. Ultimately, Chris's research seeks to inform river and water management to promote sustainable and more abundant fish populations for the benefit of the River Murray ecosystem and the broader community. Please welcome Chris.
So I might start off, I suppose, how everyone else has and talk a bit about Chowilla and my personal experience there. Tony mentioned I've been doing fish stuff for about 20 years, and one of the first places I ever got to go when I started working at SARDI was up to Chowilla, working with Brenton and a bunch of other crew at SARDI. And as you all know, it's just an amazing place, and it holds quite a close place in my heart. We're going to talk about two primary things today, Brenton and I. So Jan mentioned earlier that there's two major types of monitoring program that go along with TLM. There's condition monitoring and intervention monitoring. And really, condition monitoring is about going out there and seeing what are the patterns in the flora and fauna we see out in the floodplain. And really, intervention monitoring is more so about finding out what's going on, under the surface and what are the mechanisms driving a lot of the patterns we're seeing. So those are the two things that we'll largely talk about today. So I'd also like to firstly acknowledge the First Peoples of the River Murray and Mallee, and the traditional owners of the Chowilla area that have this incredible connection to the Chowilla area. And indeed, a really important component of that is the fish that reside in this area. And I think we've all got probably a pretty strong connection to the fish of the area. I really want to acknowledge some colleagues as well before I kick off too far. Given that we've been working at Chowilla for 20 years, a range of people have gone through our workplace and others to help us undertake the research that we do. A lot of it's been led by Brenton and I, but there's just a huge cast of people that have helped out over the years. These are mostly just SARDI staff, but as mentioned already, SA Water staff and others play a really critical role for us as well. So where are we in the landscape? I'm going to talk a bit broadly about what we'll call the lower River Murray, and for us we really mean below the junction with the Darling River, not the lower part of the Murray in South Australia, but from the Darling down. You'll probably hear me say lower river a bunch of times, and as you all well know, Chowilla's sitting there adjacent Loch 6. Now, we've done a lot to the river since Europeans colonised the place. It works pretty hard. We suck a lot of water out of the river. We've got these large headwater dams, and obviously in our part of the river we've got these serial weirs that have been constructed throughout the whole thing. And that's really changed the nature of the river in South Australia. Taking the water out of it has definitely had an influence on flooding frequency, duration, extent, but really I think potentially a more major change has been the construction of those serial weirs along the main channel of the river. Now, what has that done? This plot here presents elevation on the y-axis, the left-hand side of the graph, from Hume Dam down to the sea. And every one of those step changes in elevation represents a weir or a flow regulating structure. Now, it's pretty quick to see, and if you know the river further upstream from South Australia, there's a range of weirs that were never constructed. They're not numbered. We go up to 11, then we go to 15, then we go to 26. Now, because of that, those areas still maintain the characteristics of the natural River Murray. And what that is a flowing, what we call lotic river system. So not necessarily in flood all the time, but the water is moving. And it's that flowing water that a range of our aquatic animals like Murray cod and things like Murray cray, certain mussels, a range of other different species really depend upon. The only flowing reaches left now are much further upstream, perennially flowing. And really the main channel of the river down here is largely lake-like a lot of the time. However, what the construction of the locks did was it also transferred some of those habitats into ana branches that were adjacent to the river, and one in particular is Chowilla. And because Chowilla initially didn't have a structure like a weir on it, basically the head differential across Loch 6 is dissipated through the creeks of Chowilla. And while that's important, I'll tell you in a minute. So this is a schematic of the system. Doesn't quite look like the map. I stole this off Brenton, but I thought it was an easier way to explain how the system works with what creeks flow where. Many of you probably know all this information already, but the primary thing is that there are numerous influent creeks that flow off the river upstream of Lock 6, and they all ultimately flow into Chowilla Creek, which flows back into the river. Now, because of this as well, we've got all the floodplain lakes that Grace was just talking about too. The place just really supports this huge mosaic of aquatic habitats. It's not all one type. There's a range of different habitats there. One thing that's really unique, like I was talking about a minute ago with this head differential that's dissipated across the system, are these perennially flowing creeks like the top left on here, like Slaney Creek or Pipeclay Creek. Then there's slower flowing anabranches like Monoman Creek or Punka. It's also got a range of backwaters like the Slaney Billabong and indeed all these ephemeral lakes out the back. And of course adjacent riverine habitats as well. So the place has just got this incredible diversity of aquatic habitats. Now the importance of the place for fish has been long understood. Commercial fishing took place in Chowilla for quite a long time. There were some early investigations by scientists of fish assemblages at the site. There's one I've got a photocopy of here from Brian Pearce back in the 1990s. And ultimately the importance of the place broadly for the River Murray ecosystem was recognised by being considered a TLM Icon Site. Now fish initially weren't considered real upfront in that sort of membership of TLM, but not long afterwards indeed they were, and fish are now really front and centre at the Icon Site at Chowilla, and something that's quite a focus for the site. Since that time, a lot's changed. We've heard about the regulator. That's a real primary change to the site. We've now got basically a whole other weir sitting at the bottom of the site, which can be used obviously to raise water levels, but I will mention also fragment the place when it's in place. In addition, Jan mentioned before these old regulators that we had on Pipeclay and Slaney. They've been removed. They were really bad barriers to fish movement. They're gone. We've now got these newer regulators with a greater level of functionality. These also incorporate fishways. That's all site-based stuff, but a lot of other changes have happened more broadly across the basin, and one of which was mentioned before was the basin plan. And the basin plan set the framework for buying back water from irrigators to provide a pool of environmental water to deliver across the basin. And that now happens on an annual basis to the Lower Murray, of which Chowilla sits within. And this plot is simply up here to show the increasing of holdings of environmental water since the basin plan came into play. So now the Chew hold over 2,000 gigalitres of water typically on an annual basis, and a lot of that is delivered to the Lower Murray, which has had some fundamental changes to our flow regime. Now, I mentioned before, Brent and I are going to talk about a couple different things. This is a diagram or a schematic that came from the late Keith Walker, who was an academic at the University of Adelaide, and really I think everyone that's spoken tonight, Keith played at least some role as a mentor to each of us. Was really one of the original doyens of the Lower River Murray. And what this diagram seeks to show is how monitoring and targeted research really work together to inform management. They're kind of two different things. And his quote is, "The goal of monitoring is to identify pattern, research is to understand process, and management uses both kinds of this information." So I'm going to talk to you about the patterns. Brenton's going to talk to you about the really interesting research aspects of it, but both of which really have to feed up to people like Ali, Jan and Tony to help us manage the site and the river more broadly. Jace forewarned you that you'd see a hydrograph in the fish talk. Always going to happen. I just wanted to put a bit of context to when we've started monitoring here and what's happened over time. So I won't run through the hydrograph in too much detail, but basically when we started monitoring at Chowilla in 2005, we were in the guts of the Millennium Drought. Then there was flooding obviously here and there in 10, 11 and the subsequent floods. Basin plan in 2012. One thing I would want to point out with the advent of environmental water, if you look between the floods, look at the years when there hasn't been any flooding, but compare that to the Millennium Drought, and you can see that flow has increased in low flow years quite dramatically compared to the previous period. Environmental water's had a pretty big role to play in that. The regulator was constructed in 2014, and those red dots there basically represent times when the regulator was operated. That's what it looks like when the regulator's operated, and that's what it looks like when the river floods. And I had to get a typical flood photo up there. onto our actual monitoring. Since 2005, we've been undertaking electrofishing surveys at Chowilla, and whilst electrofishing might immediately seem to be a bit of a technique that might not be great for fish, it's actually one of the best techniques for sampling fish with the least amount of harm, and you can sample a large area rapidly. It's a really good technique. Hopefully some of you might have been able to see the demonstration that we did at Loxton a few weeks back, or maybe late February. So we sample 22 sites across Chowilla every single autumn and have done every year since '05. This other picture in the bottom left here is a picture of a sectioned fish otolith, or from a golden perch or callop. So every year we do collect a number of callop from the region, sacrifice those fish and remove their otoliths, which are their ear stones. They're analogous to tree rings, so the fish lay them down in increments, and we're able to count those increments to see how old those fish are. And looking at golden perch age structures is something that we do on an annual basis as well, so I'll talk a bit about this data in a second. Now, there are lots of objectives and targets under TLM for fishers, like Jason presented before, but I'm actually not going to tell you anything about those. They sort of are a bit jargony, but I'm just going to tell you what fish we catch and basically some patterns that we've seen over the years, and then it will hopefully feed straight into Brenton talking about some of the mechanisms. Here's a handful of fish that we catch regularly on the Chowilla floodplain, or in the water of the Chowilla floodplain. Diversity doesn't change much between years. Pretty much every year we'd catch 14 or 15 species of fish. But what does vary is the abundance of these fish over time. Things that are really common: piebary or bony herring, probably the most abundant fish we sample. A range of small-bodied species like unspecked hardyhead, carp, gudgeon, Australian smelt. Invasive things like redfin and obviously carp. And a range of large-bodied native fishes like catfish and silver perch, which aren't overly common, but we do tend to catch them every year. And I'll talk a bit about some of the more common bigger fish shortly. Another thing that we notice when we look at the data as a whole, that whole 20-year data set, if we look at it spatially. Now, I spoke about the particular aquatic habitats that we have within the place: fast-flowing creeks, slow-flowing creeks, wetlands, etc. All these large-bodied native fishes, the ones that we care about to go and angle, and also ones that are important from a conservation standpoint, like silver perch and catfish and Murray cod, all of them have a strong association with these fast-flowing creeks within Chowilla. These creeks that represent the habitat that was once characteristic of the natural Lower Murray, but is now incredibly rare. Now, I've picked these three species because I think they're probably most topical. Everyone's familiar with them, but I thought I might run through some abundance data over the past 20 years for Murray cod, golden perch and common carp. The patterns are actually really quite different to one another, and you'll understand why when I start to talk about these guys, because they do have quite different life histories. So this is a plot of Murray cod abundance since 2005 across all of our 22 sites at Chowilla. Abundance does, and behind it as well, behind those bars, that blue plot is the hydrograph basically over that period. Abundance does go up and down a bit through time, but not greatly. We see some declines. So notable declines were in 2011, post the 2010-11 flood, 2017 after the 2016-17 flood. You may have seen throughout the basin, or particularly further upstream from here, but it does tend to happen here every now and then. There can be deaths associated with blackwater. Brent might talk a bit about that later, but that might be a mechanism there. But overall, things don't change that much abundance-wise. But abundance doesn't really tell you everything. It's important to understand what's going on with the demographics of these fish. This species lives potentially over 40 years. It's really long-lived, large animal. Things don't necessarily change that quick population-wise. So I just wanted to pick three particular years: 2009, towards the end of the millennium drought; 2016, after things had improved a bit and there'd been a few flows; and 2023, after the most recent flood. These are length distributions for Murray cod from Chowilla. So basically each of these bars represents the proportion of the population within that certain length range. So we've got fish here from probably 60 millimetres through to almost 1300 millimetres. So fish of a few grams through to 35, 40 kilo. And what you notice by looking at these three different years that are very, very different in flow, every year at Chowilla we've got big fish. every year we've got medium fish, and every year we've got little fish, which I know it doesn't seem quite so unusual, right? But it actually is. In 2009, if you were to look at a length distribution of fish from the main channel of the Lower Murray, particularly further downstream from here, those little fish were they were absent from those length distributions. They simply were not there. Even sort of the medium-sized fish were largely not there, and the population was dominated by large old fish because there hadn't been much recruitment. So all this really is showing us is that fish recruit in Chowilla every year, and they complete their whole life cycle, or can complete their whole life cycle within Chowilla, and therefore it's a pretty special place for Murray cod. Now on to Callop or golden perch. You can see the abundance of this species has varied over the years very differently to Murray cod. A massive spike in 2011 post the 2010-11 flooding. Other increases in abundance associated with flooding have not been as big, but there are little upticks in 2017 and also most recently in 2023. Again, just looking at abundance doesn't show you everything that's going on. So instead of looking at length distributions for this species, we're going to look at some age structures. So these take a little while to explain, but basically the years start at 2005 at the top of the y-axis, and then as we run down, they go all the way down to 2023. But if you look at a row and you move across to the right, that's the proportion of the population made up of fish of that age. So we've got fish from 0, what we call a young of year, so a fish that spawned the previous spring, all the way through to fish of over 20-something years of age. Now what you'll notice is very obvious to see each year there is a progression of these fish of a certain age through the population. And if we track that back to the years that they're spawned, you actually find out that these fish, they might spawn more often than this, but basically fish that then recruit to the adult population, that recruitment is only very episodic. It only happens every so often, and it's invariably associated with flow. So for fish spawned in South Australia, recruitment typically occurs during either really high flow or flood, and there's a few other things that can go on that Brenton may talk about later, I'm not too sure, but ultimately the recruitment of this fish and its population dynamics are really, really intricately linked with flow, not at the scale of Chowilla, but at the scale of the entire Lower Murray and even further. So really what we do at Chowilla does not influence the recruitment of these fish, but keeping the place well connected helps them move in and out and then be part of the ecosystem at Chowilla. But management of Chowilla does not influence the population dynamics of golden perch. Carp, however, are a bit of a different story. Again, different pattern with carp, and something that's really, really obvious straight away. These fish are even more linked to flow and water level. Increases in abundance of carp have been drastic. 2011, 2017 and 2023, when the species was probably the most abundant it's ever been pretty much since they invaded the river. Again, to look in a bit further, we'll look at a couple of different years here. 2018, 2019 and 2023. The first 2 years are both low flow years, but one in which there was a regulator operation and one when there wasn't, and then 2023, the most recent really big flood. Now, interesting to see that the 2 years that have the most similar length distribution are actually a regulator operation during a low flow year and the flood. Yeah, the fish were much less abundant in 2019 compared to 2023, but one thing you'll notice is that young fish are present in both of those years. But during the low flow, no operation year, very low abundances of newly recruited carp. So what this is showing us is that one of the major risks, and it was sort of well understood really, is that when you hold back water using a regulator, you create conditions that are ideal for spawning and recruitment of these fish. These guys love inundated floodplains. That's where they like to go and spawn. It doesn't matter if it's over large scales or small scales, they like whatever happens. So operating the regulator, a known risk is that we will increase populations or you will support recruitment of carp and potentially contribute to populations as well. So just to come back, a few key learnings. I hope I've showed it's pretty obvious that the flowing water habitats that we have within Chowilla, the whole system, places like Slaney Creek, Pipe Clay, Swifties and others, are just really critical to support the assemblage that we've got at Chowilla and the species that really give it the value. These different species, it's not, I suppose, surprising. They all have different life histories, so they respond to flow in different ways. They move differently as well. Brent will talk about that in a sec. But some of them operate at large scale, some at small scale. Some can be influenced by management at the scale of Chowilla, and others don't. To touch on what Grace was saying earlier, really can't say enough how important these long-term data sets are. This is now one of the longest running data sets on fish in the whole basin, really. And it's really been quite incredible. And it gives you the power to then look at patterns, come up with hypotheses that then you can ultimately go out and test to find out what are the real underlying mechanisms resulting in what you're seeing out there in the environment. So it's important to have monitoring, and it's important to have allied research. And Brenton will touch on a bunch of that straight after me. So thank you very much.